the smell hit you first. Not smoke, not yet. Something worse. The scent of a city cooking from the inside out. Tar bubbling in the streets, pitch melting off warehouse walls, and beneath it all, the sickly sweetness of exotic spices burning alongside human flesh. Then the sound. A roar so constant, so overwhelming, that survivors would describe it as standing inside thunder that never stopped. The crack of timber splitting. The crash of buildings surrendering to gravity. Church bells ringing frantically, desperately, until the towers themselves caught fire and the bells came screaming down in molten bronze. And the heat. A quarter mile from the flames, a quarter mile, and your skin would blister. Lead poured off church roofs like waterfalls, pooling in the streets, flowing downhill in silver rivers. So stone walls that had stood for centuries exploded from the inside, moisture trapped within them turning to steam with nowhere to go. This was London. September 1666. 4 days that would erase 8 centuries of history. It began with one man climbing the stairs to his bedroom. Thomas Fariner, baker to King Charles II himself, checked his ovens one final time, dampened the fires, secured the doors, satisfied, tired, ready for sleep. He had no way of knowing that buried deep in the ash of his oven, a single ember still glowed. No way of knowing that by dawn his family would be crawling across rooftops to survive. No way of knowing that his maid, too terrified to make the jump between buildings, would become the first victim of a fire that would leave 200,000 people homeless. One ember, one bakery, one city about to die. By Sunday morning, 300 homes would be ash. By Monday, 3,000. By Wednesday night, 13,000 houses destroyed. 87 churches obliterated. St. Paul's Cathedral, the spiritual heart of Protestant England, reduced to a smoking shell. The Royal Exchange, nerve center of global commerce, evaporated. 436 acres within the city walls, gone. 80% of London, erased in 4 days. Was this the end? Could any city survive such annihilation? This is the story of the week that burned down the Middle Ages. How a medieval city built over 800 years vanished in less than 100 hours, and how one architect named Christopher Wren would spend the next 35 years of his life rebuilding it as something the world had never seen, the first modern metropolis. From Pudding Lane to St. Paul's Cathedral, and from the ashes of the old world to the birth of the new. This is the Great Fire of London. But to understand why this catastrophe was inevitable, why London wasn't just destroyed but was practically designed to be destroyed, we need to go back. Before the flames, before the ember, before Thomas Fariner climbed those stairs, we need to understand the city that couldn't survive. In 1666, London was a paradox wrapped in timber and pitch. It was, by almost any measure, the wealthiest city in Europe. The heart of an emerging global empire. Ships from every corner of the known world crowded the Thames, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, Ottoman, their holds bursting with silk and spices, tobacco and sugar, wool and wine. The plague had killed 100,000 Londoners just the year before. 1 in 5 residents dead in a single summer. The sunlight barely reached the ground. Buildings leaned toward each other across narrow lanes, their upper stories jutting out so far that neighbors on opposite sides could shake hands from their windows. London was magnificent. London was filthy. London was rich beyond imagination, and London was a bomb waiting for a match. And to understand why the Great Fire became the Great Fire, why a bakery blaze that should have been contained in minutes instead consumed a civilization, we must examine the 5 pillars of London's vulnerability. 5 fatal flaws, built up over centuries, invisible to everyone living among them. Each one alone might have been survivable. Together, they guaranteed catastrophe. The first pillar, The timber trap. London was not built of stone. London was built of wood, oak beams and elm frames, pine floors and cedar shingles, every wall, every roof, every staircase. Timber. But not just any timber. Timber that had been standing for decades, sometimes centuries. Timber dried by countless summers. Timber coated in pitch and tar to keep out the rain. Timber that wasn't just flammable, it was kindling waiting for a spark. They walked down any London street in 1666, already dead, already dry, arranged in the perfect shape for burning. The second pillar, the density curse. 80,000 souls lived within London's ancient walls. Walls built by Romans for a city 1/10 that size. There was nowhere to go but up. Buildings rose 4, 5, 6 stories high. Each floor jutted further over the street than the one below. A style called jettying between opposing buildings at roof level was less than 3 feet. A fire that started in one house didn't need to jump to the next. It could simply reach across and touch it. The third pillar, the connectivity paradox. London's greatest strength was about to become its greatest weakness. Those warehouses lining the Thames, those counting houses in the Exchange, those shops overflowing with goods from around the world, they weren't just full of merchandise. They were full of combustibles. Walk down Thames Street and you'd find warehouse after warehouse packed with tallow for candles, pitch for ships, brandy by the barrel, oil by the cask, hemp and flax and coal, and anything else that could burn hot and fast and long. One merchant might store a year's fortune in materials that, given the right spark, would burn like a bonfire soaked in lamp oil. The wealth that made London great had filled it with fuel. The fourth pillar, the water illusion. Surely, you might think, a city this wealthy would have proper firefighting equipment. Surely there were pumps, dual hydrants, organized brigades. There were not. London's water came from wooden pipes. Yes, wooden, buried beneath the streets, fed by hand-pumped wells and the natural pressure of gravity from reservoirs on higher ground. The flow was weak. The pressure was pathetic. The pipes themselves were made of hollowed-out elm logs that would burn just as readily as anything else. The city's firefighting strategy, such as it was, relied on leather buckets passed hand to hand in human chains, on hooks and ropes to pull down burning buildings before they could spread, on axes to create fire breaks by demolishing structures in the fire's path. But here's the thing about demolishing buildings. In 1666 London, you couldn't just do it. You needed permission, which brings us to the fifth pillar, the fatal one. And the one that would transform a containable fire into an unstoppable inferno. The fifth pillar, the property cage, sacred like men had died in civil wars over this sacred. The king himself had been executed just 17 years earlier, sat uneasily on a restored throne, acutely aware that his father's fate could become his own if he pushed too hard. If he looked at a small fire in a bakery at 3 in the morning and decided it wasn't worth the legal headache of tearing down buildings, then the fire would spread, and spread, and spread, until permission no longer mattered, until there was nothing left to demolish, until London itself was ash. Let me take you there, to the streets that were about to burn. Pudding Lane isn't grand. It's a narrow, crooked street running down toward the Thames, named for the puddings, and beneath it all, the permanent stench of a city without sewers. Thomas Farriner's bakery sits near the bottom of the lane. Through the window, you might see the last loaves coming out of the oven. Farriner himself, flour dusted on his apron, preparing to close up for the night. There's nothing remarkable about this scene. This is simply London. Simply Saturday, simply the end of another week. But turn around. Look toward the river. And there, on Thames Street, the warehouses loom like sleeping giants. 5 stories tall, packed floor to ceiling with the treasures and dangers of global trade. In one warehouse, enough tallow to make in another pitch barrels stacked to the rafters. In a third, casks of brandy and oil, hemp bales and coal stores, everything a fire could ever want to eat. In 24 hours, Thames Street will be a river of flame. The warehouses won't burn building by building. They'll explode. The heat will be so intense that people on the opposite bank of the river will feel their skin burning, starting new fires faster than anyone can respond. But right now, on this quiet Saturday evening, and Thames Street is just commerce, just prosperity, just London doing what London does. This is where global trade happened, where a merchant might shake hands on a deal that would send wool to Constantinople and bring silk back to London, where fortunes were made and lost on the turning of tides and the shifting of winds. In 1666, this was the heartbeat of an empire. Today, a sanitized walkway where tourists sip coffee and take photographs of a river that no longer remembers the flames. There's one more thing you need to understand about this city, one more factor that transformed vulnerability into certainty. The summer of 1666 had been brutally dry, week after week of sunshine and heat. The kind of summer that sounds pleasant until you realize what it means for a city built of timber. Every beam, every board, and every pitch-coated shingle had spent months baking in the heat. The wood wasn't just dry, it was desiccated, starving for moisture, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. Old-timers muttered about fire risk. Pamphlets warned of God's judgment, pointing to the plague of 1665 as the first punishment and prophesying worse to come. But prophecy is easy to ignore when business is good and the sun is shining. What Londoners didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their timber water pipes, buried beneath the streets, were just as dry as everything else. When the fire came, when they desperately needed water to fight the flames, those pipes would burn. Underground, invisible, the city's fire-fighting infrastructure would be consumed by the very disaster it was meant to prevent. What they also didn't know, fire doesn't just spread. And at a certain intensity, it transforms. It stops being a thing that burns from building to building and becomes a thing that creates its own weather. A firestorm, a self-sustaining apocalypse that generates winds powerful enough to carry embers a quarter-mile ahead, powerful enough to topple walls, powerful enough to suck the air out of lungs. London had never seen a firestorm. The word didn't exist yet. In 4 days, they would learn what it meant. Everything was in place. 8 centuries of accumulated vulnerability. A summer of drought. Warehouses stuffed with combustibles. Streets too narrow to fight fires. Water systems too weak to matter. Legal structures that prioritized property over survival. The powder keg was loaded, packed tight, waiting. All it needed now was a spark. Saturday, September 1st, 1666, 11:47 in the evening. Thomas Fariner climbed the stairs to his bedroom for the last time in the life he knew. Below him, the ovens sat quiet. He'd raked the coals, dampened the fires, closed the flues. Done everything right, done everything he'd done 1,000 nights before. His daughter Hannah was already asleep. His son and a manservant occupied the rooms above. The maid had fallen silent, the usual noise of carts and voices replaced by the peaceful darkness of a city at rest. Fariner paused at his window, looked out at the night, thought about the week ahead, the bread to be baked, the customers to serve. Perhaps he said a prayer. Perhaps he simply yawned. Then he went to bed. For 2 hours, nothing happened, and the bakery settled into its nighttime rhythms. Timber cooling, embers fading. Silence so complete you could hear rats moving in the walls. This was the London night, dark, quiet, vulnerable. But deep in the belly of one oven, something survived. A single ember, no larger than a coin, buried beneath ash that should have smothered it. Should have. But the ash had shifted. A tiny gap had opened. And through that gap, the ember found what it needed most: air. At 1:15 in the morning, the ember began to glow brighter. Oxygen feeding its hunger, heat building in a space no one was watching. At 1:45, the glow found the wooden frame around the oven, dry as bone, waiting, silent. At 2:15, in wood that had been merely hot began to char, the chemistry of combustion taking hold, carbon releasing, temperature climbing. At 2:30, the char became flame, small, tentative, a tongue of fire licking at the timber frame, tasting it, deciding. At 2:45, the flame made its decision. It spread. Thomas Farriner woke to smoke, not the comfortable smell of banked fires and baking bread. Something wrong, something urgent, smoke thick enough to taste, filling his lungs with every breath. He threw off his blankets, stumbled to the door, opened it. The stairs were already burning. For a moment, just a moment, he stood, frozen. The human mind struggles to accept catastrophe. It wasn't possible. He'd checked the ovens, he'd dampened the fires, he'd done everything right. But the flames climbing his staircase didn't care about what he'd done. "Get up! Fire! Fire!" The next minutes became a blur of smoke and panic and desperate motion. Hannah, his daughter, scrambling from her bed, his son kicking through a window to reach the roof. The manservant following, coughing, eyes streaming. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple. The buildings on Pudding Lane were so close together that their roofs nearly touched. If you could get outside, if you could climb to the roof, you could jump to the next building, then the next, until you reached a house that wasn't burning. One by one, the Farriner family made the crossing, Thomas first, testing the gap. Hannah behind him, her father's hand gripping hers as she leaped. The son, the servant, but the maid. In daylight, with solid ground beneath you, a simple step. In darkness, with flames behind you and a 60-foot drop below, something else entirely. "Jump! You have to jump!" Thomas Farriner shouted from the neighboring roof. The fire was spreading fast now, eating through the bakery's upper floors, reaching toward the window where the maid stood paralyzed. I can't. She never jumped. The fire that had begun with one ember in one oven had claimed its first victim, whose entire existence would be reduced to a single historical footnote, the first to die. She would not be the last. The fire spread. From the Farriner bakery to the Star Inn next door, the Lord Mayor of London arrived. Sir Thomas Bloodworth was not a courageous man. He was not a decisive man. He was a wealthy merchant who'd risen to the mayoralty through connections and commerce, not through any particular talent for crisis management. He'd been roused from bed by frantic messengers, dragged through dark streets to witness a fire he didn't want to deal with. He stood on Fish Street, watched the flames consuming half a dozen buildings, and made his assessment. Pish! A woman could piss it out. Those words, recorded by Samuel Pepys, who would hear them repeated throughout the day, became the epitaph for medieval London. Not the fire itself, but the refusal to take it seriously. The bureaucratic hesitation that transformed disaster into apocalypse. Because here's what Lord Mayor Bloodworth could have done in that moment. He could have authorized the immediate demolition of buildings in the fire's path. He could have ordered houses pulled down to create a firebreak. It would have destroyed property. It would have been legally complicated. It would have made powerful enemies. It also would have stopped the fire. Instead, Bloodworth hesitated. Worried about property rights, worried about liability, worried about everything except the flames that were already reaching toward Thames Street. And by the time he changed his mind, by the time he finally authorized demolitions, it was too late. The window had closed. The fire had grown too large. The point of no return came at dawn. The fire reached the first warehouse on Thames Street. What happened next wasn't fire spreading from building to building. It was transformation. a change in the fundamental nature of what was burning. The warehouse was packed with barrels of pitch, tar, tallow, oil, the concentrated fuel of global commerce, stacked floor to ceiling, beam to beam. The flames didn't creep into the warehouse. They exploded. Not the warmth of a fireplace or even the searing pain of touching a hot stove, but a force so intense that it seemed to have weight, pressing against anyone who came near. People 100 yards away felt their skin beginning to blister. People a quarter-mile away shielded their faces from the radiant heat. And the fire, fed by the impossible feast of combustibles in the warehouses, began to create something no one in London had ever witnessed. A firestorm. The science is straightforward. Fire needs oxygen. A fire large enough and hot enough will consume the oxygen around it faster than the atmosphere can replenish it. This creates a vacuum, a low-pressure zone at the heart of the blaze. Air rushes in to fill the void. The larger the fire, the stronger the rush. At a certain point, and that rush becomes wind, which creates more vacuum, which draws more wind. The firestorm was born on Thames Street on the morning of September 2nd, 1666, and once it existed, it could not be stopped. The winds generated by the blaze reached speeds that toppled walls. Embers, some as large as a man's fist, were lifted hundreds of feet into the air and carried a quarter-mile ahead of the main fire, landing on rooftops that hadn't yet felt the heat, starting new blazes faster than anyone could respond. This wasn't a fire spreading. This was a fire exploding in all directions simultaneously. By noon on Sunday, the inferno had consumed everything between Pudding Lane and the river. It was moving north toward the Royal Exchange, the west toward the wealth of Cheapside, east toward the Tower of London and its stores of gunpowder. And London was only beginning to understand what it faced. The collapse began at the level of the individual. Neighbors who'd lived side by side for decades found themselves competing for the same narrow lane, the same overloaded cart, the same terrified horse. Friendships built over years dissolved in minutes as people fought for space to escape, come to blows over whose goods would be loaded onto a wagon first. By the time the fight was over, the fire had reached the wagon. Neither man's goods survived. Then the collapse reached families. Parents made impossible calculations. How much could they carry? Which possessions mattered? And worst of all, when the children were too many and the time too short, which child could walk and which needed to be carried? A woman named Margaret, whose last name the records don't preserve, described choosing between her grandmother's silver candlesticks and her daughter's hand. The little girl couldn't navigate the rubble alone. The candlesticks had been in the family for 4 generations. Margaret chose her daughter. That night, when they'd reached safety north of the walls, she learned that the heat had been so intense that silver had melted and run like water. The candlesticks she'd abandoned wouldn't have survived anyway. The collapse reached commerce next. The Royal Exchange, that magnificent building where global trade pulsed through London, became a furnace. The merchants who'd stored fortunes in its vaults watched as flames consumed contracts, ledgers, the paper proof of wealth accumulated over lifetimes. One observer wrote that you could see men standing motionless before the burning exchange, their faces blank, as if their minds had simply stopped working. Some tried to save what they could. They hired porters at increasingly outrageous rates to carry goods to safety. But safe where? The fire was moving faster than the evacuation. Goods carried a quarter-mile north in the morning had to be moved again by afternoon, and again by evening. Some merchants moved their possessions 3, 4, 5 times before finally losing everything. Then law itself collapsed. The courts closed. Property rights, so sacred that they'd paralyzed Lord Mayor Bloodworth at the crucial moment, now meant nothing at all. Men who'd spent lifetimes building estates watched as those estates became ash, and there was no court to appeal to, no authority to demand compensation from, no legal framework that could make any sense of what was happening. And then meaning collapsed. The churches had been the constant. Through plague, through war, through fire, the churches had stood. Their bells had rung the hours, called the faithful, marked the rhythms of life and death. They were stone and permanence and God's presence in the midst of chaos. But the churches burned. One by one. Saint Magnus the martyr, Saint Margaret, Saint Botolph, All Hallows. Their bells rang frantically as the flames approached, warning bells, desperate bells, bells crying out for help that wouldn't come. Crashing down through burning floors, their final sound not a ring, but a scream. Silence spread across neighborhoods that had never known silence. The absence of bells was worse somehow than the roar of flames. It meant the churches were gone. It meant God's houses had fallen. What did that say about God's protection? Finally, humanity itself began to collapse. Looting started by Sunday afternoon. Desperate people taking what they could from abandoned homes, telling themselves they'd return it later, knowing they wouldn't. Violence followed, not systematic, not organized, but brutal and random. A foreigner, a Frenchman, was beaten nearly to death on suspicion of starting the fire. So he'd been carrying fireballs, actually tennis balls, and that was enough to condemn him in the eyes of a mob searching for someone to blame. The Dutch were targeted. The Catholics. Anyone who looked wrong, sounded wrong, seemed wrong. The fire had to be someone's fault. It couldn't be just accident, just ember, just dry timber and bad luck. It had to be arson. It had to be attack. It had to be war. And so the thin veneer of civilization, already cracked by disaster, began to peel away entirely, revealing what lay beneath. By Sunday evening, the fire had consumed 300 houses. By Monday noon, 3,000. By Monday night, the flames had reached Cheapside, the widest street in London, the center of goldsmiths and haberdashers, the showcase of the city's wealth. His wine, his Parmesan cheese, his papers, hoping the ground would protect what the buildings could not. He described the Thames choked with boats, thousands of vessels, from grand merchant ships to tiny rowboats packed with people and possessions, fleeing a city that had become uninhabitable. The river itself reflected the flames, turning the water orange, making it seem as if the Thames too was burning. From the Tower of London, Pepys watched the destruction spread. And he wrote of flames consuming street after street in a bow of fire, an arc of destruction stretching from one horizon to the other, beautiful and terrible, unstoppable. But the worst was yet to come. Tuesday, September 4th. The third day. The fire had consumed the eastern half of the city. It had devoured Cheapside. It had jumped streets that should have been too wide to cross. It had shrugged off every attempt to stop it. And now it was coming for St. Paul's. The old cathedral stood on Ludgate Hill, the highest point within London's walls. It had dominated the skyline for 5 centuries, a massive Gothic structure, longer than a football field, its spire once rising higher than any building in England until lightning had claimed it 100 years before. St. Paul's was more than a church. It was London's soul given physical form. The kings had been crowned within its walls. Treaties had been signed beneath its vaulted ceilings. Generations of Londoners had marked the passages of their lives there. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, carried into the cathedral and piled in the crypt, in the nave, in every available corner. They were so confident, so certain that stone meant safety. What they didn't know, what no one in London had ever had reason to learn, was that stone could burn. Not in the way wood burns. Not with flames and kindling, but heat, intense enough heat, sustained long enough, will do things to stone that seem impossible. The moisture trapped within the rock turns to steam. The steam expands, and with nowhere to go, the stone explodes. At 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the fire reached the buildings surrounding St. Paul's. At noon, the scaffolding caught. This was the cruel irony. The cathedral had been under renovation for years. Christopher Wren himself had surveyed it, proposed repairs, overseen the beginning of restoration work. Wooden scaffolding wrapped the exterior walls, platforms and poles and ladders, all of it dry, all of it waiting. The scaffolding became a ladder for the flames. Fire climbed the wooden framework, reaching heights it never could have achieved on its own, and it licked at the roof. Found the timber beams hidden beneath the lead sheathing, and within an hour, St. Paul's Cathedral, London's supposedly fireproof sanctuary, was burning from the top down. The lead went first. 6 acres of lead roofing, heated beyond its melting point, began to flow. Contemporary accounts describe it as a waterfall, a cascade of molten metal pouring down the walls, pooling in the streets below, running downhill toward the river like silver lava. The sound was unlike anything witnesses had heard before. A hissing, splattering roar as liquid lead struck stone and cooled, and was covered by more liquid lead. Men who'd taken shelter against the cathedral walls fled screaming as the metal river reached them. The accumulated knowledge of centuries burst into flame without being touched. The cathedral became an oven, and everything inside it cooked. Then the stones began to explode. It started with the smaller pieces, decorative elements, carved saints and angels. They cracked, they shattered, they flew apart with sounds like cannon fire, sending shrapnel across the cathedral close. Then the larger stones, the walls themselves, blocks that had stood for 500 years, weathering every storm, every war, every threat the centuries could offer, suddenly failed. The moisture within them, moisture absorbed over decades of London rain, flashed to steam. The pressure built, and the stones detonated. Contemporary accounts describe the sound as thunderous, continuous, each explosion triggering another, a cascade of destruction that seemed to feed upon itself. The great rose windows shattered. The vaulted ceiling collapsed in sections, sending tons of debris crashing to the floor below. The floor itself, the tombs beneath it, the crypts that held the bones of generations, was buried under rubble and fire. By Tuesday evening, St. Paul's Cathedral was a ruin. The building still stood technically. Walls remained upright, fragments of the tower pointed toward the sky, but everything that had made it St. Paul's, the beauty, the sanctity, the sense of permanence, was gone. The Londoners who witnessed it from across the river wept openly. The diarist, John Evelyn, wrote that seeing St. Paul's burn was like watching the death of a parent, something you always knew would happen someday but could never truly prepare for. The grief was physical, visceral, a wound that would take decades to heal. And yet the fire wasn't finished. West of St. Paul's stood the Guildhall. If the cathedral was London's soul, the Guildhall was its memory. Here, the city's archives were stored. Records of commerce and governance stretching back centuries. The minutes of council meetings. The charters of guilds. The legal documents that proved who owned what and who owed whom, in wooden rooms in a wooden building. The Guildhall burned on Tuesday afternoon. The loss is almost impossible to calculate. Not in monetary terms, though that was staggering, but in historical terms. How much of medieval London's story vanished in those flames? How many questions about the past became permanently unanswerable because the documents that could have answered them turned to ash? We'll never know. That's the point. The absence itself is invisible. The medieval city wasn't just dying. It was being erased. Its buildings, its records, its very memory consumed by flames that seemed to have no limit, no end, no possibility of being stopped. But men were trying. King Charles II had watched the first day's burning from Whitehall, miles to the west. By Monday, he'd realized that this was no ordinary fire, that the city's authorities were overwhelmed, feared that if something wasn't done, not metaphorically, not through representatives, Charles II himself traveled to the burning streets, dismounted from his horse, and joined the firefighting effort. He passed buckets. He shouted orders. He stood in the smoke and heat alongside common laborers, his royal clothing soaked with water and stained with soot. This was unprecedented. English kings didn't do manual labor. They certainly didn't stand shoulder to shoulder with commoners, risking their health and dignity in crisis response. But Charles understood something that Lord Mayor Bloodworth had not. This moment required action, not protocol. The king's brother, James, Duke of York, took command of the organized response, making decisions that the paralyzed city government couldn't seem to make. And finally, they authorized what should have been authorized from the beginning. Demolition, not with hooks and ropes, too slow, too labor-intensive. Men who knew how to bring down structures quickly and efficiently. They placed charges in buildings directly in the fire's path. They lit the fuses. The explosions echoed across London. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds, their timber frames crashing down, their rubble forming barriers that the flames would have to climb over or go around. The fire breaks began to hold. Not everywhere. The wind still carried embers over gaps that should have been wide enough, but in places, in crucial places. The fire's unstoppable advance began to slow. By Tuesday night, the eastern edge of the fire was running out of fuel. The demolished buildings had created gaps too wide to cross. Let me stop here. Let me try to make you feel what those 4 days were actually like. Forget the narrative structure. Forget the historical analysis. Just imagine. The sound. A roar so constant, so overwhelming, that it became a kind of silence. After the first few hours, you stopped hearing it as noise and started feeling it as presence. The crack of timber giving way, the crash of buildings collapsing, every few seconds another structure surrendering. To the silence spreading as church after church was consumed. That silence was worse than any noise. The smell. Not just smoke. That acrid, choking smell was only the beginning. Beneath it, layer upon layer of scent. Melting lead, a metallic taste at the back of your throat. Pitch and tar bubbling in the streets, and beneath it all, the smell no one wanted to acknowledge. The smell of flesh. More than a quarter mile away, and exposed skin would redden and blister. Your eyes would stream, your lungs would burn with each breath, and the closer you got, the worse it became, until, at a certain distance forward, motion became physically impossible. Your body simply refused to go further. The sky itself turned orange. Not during the day. During the day, the smoke was so thick that the sun became a dim red disk, barely visible through the haze. But at night, the flames lit the clouds from below, painting the heavens in colors that seemed to belong to hell rather than earth. You could see the glow from Oxford. From 50 miles away, the destruction of London was visible. Within the city, the sight was worse. Streets you'd known your entire life, unrecognizable. Buildings you'd passed every day, reduced to smoking rubble. Landmarks that had oriented your whole existence. The church where you were baptized, the market where you bought your bread, the tavern where you met your friends. All of it gone. Replaced by ash and ember and the still burning ruins of everything you'd known. When it was over, the counting began. The fire had burned 13,200 houses, not damaged, not partially destroyed, burned to ash, to nothing, to absence. 87 parish churches, gone. 44 livery halls, the headquarters of the guilds that organized London's trades, gone. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, the Guildhall, the Bridewell Palace. 4 city gates, the General Letter Office. 3 of the western city gates. Gone. In a city of 500,000, 4 out of every 10 residents had lost everything. They camped in the fields to the north. Much of what was lost couldn't be valued. How do you price the Guildhall archives? The libraries of St. Paul's? Officially, 6 people died. 6. This number is almost certainly wrong, catastrophically wrong. It counts only those whose deaths were witnessed, recorded, officially acknowledged. It doesn't count the poor who lived in the fire's path and left no records of their existence. All those who couldn't flee fast enough from a fire that moved faster than people could run. The true death toll will never be known. The heat was so intense that bodies would have been cremated completely, leaving no bones, no remains, no evidence that a person had ever existed. And the maid in Thomas Farriner's bakery, Thursday, September 6th, 1666. The fire is declared extinguished. 436 acres of ash and rubble stretching in every direction, punctuated by the skeletal remains of walls too thick to collapse, chimneys standing alone like gravestones for the houses they once warmed. The ground is still hot. In places, too hot to walk on. And cellars that had been packed with coal and combustibles continue to smolder underground, sending wisps of smoke through cracks in the rubble. Here and there, small flames still flicker, pockets of fuel that escape the main conflagration, burning themselves out slowly, stubbornly. Survivors where his grandfather built a business over 50 years and see nothing but ash. Some dig frantically, hoping to recover something. A strongbox, a family heirloom, the remains of a life. Most find nothing. The heat was too intense. Metal melted. Stone exploded. Anything that could burn, burned. And the smell lingers. That terrible combination of smoke and lead and spice and loss. It will linger for weeks, months. Some survivors will report smelling it for the rest of their lives, a phantom scent triggered by memory, by grief, by the impossibility of forgetting. 200,000 people are homeless. They cluster in the fields north of the city walls, Moorfields, Highgate, Islington. They sleep in the open air, in hastily constructed tents, in any structure that escaped the flames. They have nothing. No homes, no possessions, no clear sense of what happens next. The official death toll stands at 6. 6 names recorded. 6 deaths witnessed and documented. Everyone knows the real number is higher, but the poor leave no records, the homeless leave no trace, and bodies exposed. The fire didn't just destroy London, it erased people from history as thoroughly as if they'd never been born. And yet, in the midst of utter devastation, something unexpected was happening. Something that would transform this catastrophe into the birth of the modern world. The fire solved problems. Not intentionally, not humanely, but with the brutal efficiency of total destruction, the Great Fire accomplished things that decades of reform had failed to achieve. The plague, for instance. In 1665, just 1 year before the fire, the Black Death had swept through London. 100,000 dead, 1 in 5 residents, bodies piled in mass graves, the city traumatized, terrified, waiting for the next outbreak. But the fire killed the plague, not through any medical intervention, through heat. The rats that carried the fleas that carried the disease lived in the thatched roofs, the wooden walls, the dark corners of medieval buildings. The fire consumed those buildings utterly. It burned the thatch, it incinerated the wood, it killed the rats by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and the fleas with them. After 1666, the plague never returned to London. Never. The disease that had terrorized the city for centuries, that had killed more Londoners than any war or famine, simply vanished. Burned out of existence along with the medieval city that had harbored it. The fire also broke the guild system's stranglehold on commerce. For centuries, London's trades had been controlled by guilds, closed organizations that decided who could work, what they could charge, how they could conduct business. These guilds met in lavery halls throughout the city. They kept their records, maintained their hierarchies, enforced their monopolies. The fire destroyed 44 livery halls. It burned guild records, scattered guild members, disrupted the carefully maintained structures of control. When London rebuilt, the guilds never fully recovered their power. New trades emerged. New ways of doing business flourished. The rigid medieval economy began to give way to something more flexible, more dynamic, more modern. The fire created the insurance industry. Before 1666, the concept of fire insurance essentially didn't exist. People relied on family, on community, on luck. The Great Fire changed that calculus permanently. In 1680, Nicholas Barbon established the first fire insurance company, the Fire Office, offering Londoners protection against the catastrophe they now knew was possible. Within decades, insurance had become a cornerstone of modern commerce. Every policy sold today, every premium paid, every claim filed, traces its lineage back to a disaster that made risk suddenly, terrifyingly real. And the fire created building codes. The medieval city had burned because medieval cities were built to burn. Timber construction, narrow streets, no regulations, no standards. No one saying, "You cannot build that way because it will kill us all." After 1666, everything changed. The Rebuilding Acts, passed within months of the fire, mandated brick and stone construction. They required minimum street widths. They standardized building heights. They created setback requirements, firewall specifications, roofing material standards. For the first time in history, a government told its citizens how they had to build. Not suggested, not encouraged, required. Those codes became the template for urban planning worldwide. Every city that mandates fire-resistant materials, every regulation that requires minimum street widths, every building inspector who checks compliance with safety standards, all of them inherit the lessons paid for by medieval London. The Great Fire didn't just destroy a city. It invented the rules for building cities that wouldn't burn. But rules are just words on paper. Someone had to actually rebuild London. That someone was Christopher Wren. In 1666, Wren wasn't even an architect by training. He was 34 years old, and a professor of astronomy at Oxford, a mathematician of considerable reputation, a founding member of the Royal Society. Architecture was his hobby, his passion, yes, but not his profession. The fire changed everything. Within days of the flames dying down, while the rubble still smoldered, while refugees still huddled in the fields, Wren presented King Charles II with a vision. Not just a plan for rebuilding, a plan for transformation. Wren's design was radical, revolutionary, beautiful. He proposed demolishing what little remained of the medieval street plan and replacing it entirely. Grand boulevards radiating from central plazas. Geometric precision replacing organic chaos, vistas and perspectives and sight lines, borrowed from Rome and Paris and the Renaissance ideals that Wren had studied obsessively. And London would become the most beautiful city in Europe, a capital worthy of an empire, a monument to rational design and classical proportion. Charles was intrigued. The plan was magnificent, the vision was compelling, but there was a problem. Property rights. The same legal structures that had paralyzed Lord Mayor Bloodworth at the fire's beginning now paralyzed the rebuilding effort. Every plot of ash-covered ground had an owner. Every owner had rights. Every right was backed by centuries of English legal tradition. Charles could force the issue. He was the king. He could override property claims, impose the grand vision, create his masterpiece by royal decree. But Charles remembered his father. Charles I had pushed too hard, had overreached royal power, had triggered a civil war, lost his throne, lost his head. And Charles II had spent years in exile, had fought his way back to power, had learned the hard way that even kings have limits. Forcing property owners to surrender their land, even for a magnificent city, would risk everything. It would unite the merchants and landowners against the crown. It would raise the specter of tyranny. It might cost Charles his throne, his life. So Charles chose compromise. The grand boulevards, rejected. The geometric plazas, abandoned. The revolutionary redesign, shelved. Property owners would rebuild on their original plots. The medieval street plan would largely survive. London would remain at its core the same maze of lanes and alleys it had always been. But within that framework, everything would change. Brick, not timber. Stone, not wood. Wider streets where possible. Fire regulations rigorously enforced. And the city would improve, even if it wouldn't transform. And Christopher Wren, his grand plan rejected, received a different commission. A humbler commission, or so it seemed. Wren was appointed Royal Surveyor. His task, oversee the rebuilding of public buildings, design the new churches, and above all, create a new St. Paul's Cathedral. For most architects, this would be overwhelming. 51 parish churches to design. The cathedral that would define London's skyline for centuries. An endless stream of decisions, compromises, bureaucratic struggles. For Wren, it was opportunity. He couldn't redesign London's streets, but he could redesign London's skyline. He could place his churches at strategic points throughout the city, their spires creating a rhythm of vertical elements that would give the rebuilt London a distinctive character. And he could experiment with each building, testing ideas, refining techniques, building toward his masterpiece. Each church became a laboratory. St. Stephen Walbrook, a dome within a rectangular structure, working out principles he would later apply on a massive scale. St. Mary le Bow, a steeple so distinctive it would define what a London church spire should look like. St. Bride's Fleet Street, a wedding cake tower that would inspire countless imitations, including, legend has it, the design of tiered wedding cakes themselves. 51 churches, 51 experiments, 51 steps toward St. Paul's, and St. Paul's itself became a 35-year obsession. Wren presented his first design in 1669. The clergy rejected it. Too radical, too Roman, too Catholic-looking for Protestant England. He presented a second design. Rejected again, still too ambitious, still too different from what English cathedrals were supposed to look like. His third design, the so-called warrant design, was finally approved in 1675. It was a compromise, conservative enough to satisfy the clergy, traditional enough to look like a proper English church. But the approval warrant contained a clause. Wren was permitted to make ornamental changes during construction. Ornamental changes. Over the next 35 years, Wren used those two words to justify a complete transformation of the approved design. The cathedral that rose over London looked almost nothing like the warrant design. It was grander, more classical, more Wren. The triple dome was his masterpiece. What visitors see from outside, that magnificent silhouette against the London sky, is an outer dome. Timber frame covered in lead. Beautiful, but structurally unnecessary. What worshippers see from inside, the painted heavens curving overhead, is an inner dome. Lower, smaller, designed for the human scale of the interior. Between them, invisible to both, is a brick cone. This is the structural genius. This cone carries the weight of the lantern that crowns the cathedral. It transfers that weight down through the walls without crushing either dome. 3 domes disguised as one. An engineering solution hidden within an architectural triumph. Wren's answer to a problem that had defeated architects for centuries: how to build a dome both magnificent from outside and intimate from within. In 1711, Wren watched as his son placed the final stone atop the lantern. The architect was 79 years old. He had spent half his life building this cathedral. So he had outlived critics, buried assistants, survived regime changes and budget crises, and endless compromises. He had transformed London's skyline as surely as the fire had transformed its streets. When Wren died in 1723, his body was interred in the crypt of St. Paul's. His epitaph, carved in Latin on a simple stone, offers a challenge to visitors. Reader, if you seek his monument, look around you. Not at the tomb, at the cathedral, at the city beyond, at everything his patient genius had created from the ashes of catastrophe. Walk through London today, and the Great Fire is everywhere. Where Thomas Farriner's bakery stood, the monument rises, 202 feet tall, exactly the distance from its base to the spot where the fire began. Fluted Doric column topped by a gilded urn of flames. And you can climb 311 steps to a viewing platform at the top. Look out over the city that rose from ashes. Where Thames Street warehouses exploded in rivers of flame, tourists now sip coffee at riverside cafes. The names survive: Pudding Lane, Fish Street Hill, but nothing else. The lanes are wider, the buildings are stone. The fire of 1666 seems impossibly distant. Where St. Paul's burned for 3 days, Wren's dome dominates the skyline. It survived the Blitz when German bombs destroyed the neighborhood around it but somehow spared the cathedral. It survived the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, the Victorians, the Windsors. It has watched London transform from trading hub to imperial capital to modern megalopolis. And in the shadow of that dome, and in every building code and insurance policy and urban planning regulation, the fire lives on. Every time a city mandates fireproof materials, 1666. Every time a builder follows setback requirements, 1666. Every time an inspector checks that fire exits are accessible, 1666. The Great Fire didn't just rebuild London. It rewrote the rules for how humans build cities. Those rules spread from London to every corner of the world. They're embedded in the structures we live and work in, invisible but omnipresent, lessons paid for with 13,000 buildings and 87 churches in the medieval heart of the greatest city in Europe. 4 days. One ember to inferno. Medieval city to modern metropolis. The Great Fire taught us that the things we build for safety can become our traps. That tradition can be a cage. That property rights, pushed past their purpose, can prevent the very protection they're meant to provide. That decisive action delayed is decisive action denied, and it taught us something else. Something harder to accept, perhaps, but equally true. Sometimes, destruction is the only path to creation. Sometimes the old must burn before the new can rise. Sometimes catastrophe is the catalyst that transforms stagnation into progress. This isn't a comfortable lesson. It doesn't justify disaster or celebrate suffering, but it acknowledges a truth that the story of London makes undeniable. The city that rose from the ashes was better than the city that burned. Safer, healthier, more resilient. The plague never returned. The buildings didn't collapse in flames. The insurance industry protected against loss. The building codes prevented recurrence. But from the worst week in London's history came foundations that would support centuries of growth. From Thomas Farriner's ember came Christopher Wren's Cathedral. From Lord Mayor Bloodworth's fatal hesitation came regulations that would save countless lives. The ashes became the fertilizer for the future. For centuries, this was treated as ancient history, a disaster from a distant era, something that happened to other people in other times, safely separated from our present by 400 years of progress. But step back. Look at the patterns. A city built on aging infrastructure. Systems so complex and interconnected that a single point of failure can cascade into catastrophe. Property interests competing with collective safety. Leaders hesitating when decisive action is needed, afraid of legal consequences, paralyzed by precedent. And a population that knows, in theory, that disaster is possible, but assumes that knowledge alone provides protection, that someone else will handle it, that the worst case is too unlikely to prepare for. Does that sound like 1666, or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? Our cities are no longer built of timber, but they're built on other kinds of kindling. Power grids where one failure can black out millions. Supply chains where one disruption can empty shelves across continents. Digital networks where one breach can expose billions. We've replaced the fire risks of the 17th century with the system risks of the 21st. We've made our world safer from some catastrophes and more vulnerable to others. We've learned lessons and forgotten them and will need to learn them again. History doesn't repeat, saying the Great Fire of London will never happen again. But history rhymes, and the tests, the real tests, the ones that separate civilizations that survive from civilizations that don't, have a way of coming back. They come wearing different clothes, they speak different languages, they exploit different vulnerabilities, but they ask the same questions they've always asked. Will you act in time? Or will you hesitate? Will you prioritize safety or protect property? Will you learn from catastrophe or just suffer through it? London, in the end, learned. It transformed. It built something better from the ruins of something lost. The question for us, the question that hangs over every city, every system, every civilization built on hidden vulnerabilities, is whether we'll need our own great fire to do the same, or whether we can learn from someone else's ashes. The smoke has cleared. The rubble has been removed. The new city stands where the old city burned. But if you walk through London at night, if you stand on the monument's viewing platform and look out over the glittering metropolis, you can almost see them, the ghosts of medieval streets, the shadows of timber buildings, the echo of church bells ringing warnings that came too late. They're still there, those ghosts, woven into the fabric of a city that remembers its worst week, even as it celebrates its greatest triumph. A city that burned, a city that learned, a city that rose. Which city's secrets should we uncover next? Which disaster shaped the world we live in without our ever knowing? Let me know in the comments. I'm watching the past so we can understand the present. Together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.